France has always told a clean story about itself. The Gauls were conquered, Rome civilized them, the Franks rebuilt the land, and from that fusion, France was born. Simple, neat, finished. Except in 2024, DNA quietly broke that story apart. No press conference, no national debate, just a genetic study released by European researchers comparing modern French DNA with ancient Iron Age remains from Gaul. What they found didn't shock politicians first. It stunned geneticists because the DNA didn't match the story France teaches. Across central and southern France, regions considered fully Romanized, researchers detected a strong, persistent Celtic genetic signature, not symbolic, not cultural, biological, passed from parent to child for nearly 2,000 years. This wasn't Brittany. This wasn't a known exception. This was the French heartland itself. At first, scientists assumed error. They checked the samples, rebuilt the models, compared modern genomes to ancient burial sites dated centuries before Rome's arrival. The signals stayed. Modern French citizens, people with no Celtic language, no separate identity, no visible resistance, were carrying direct genetic continuity from pre-Roman Celtic tribes, the very people Julius Caesar claimed to have subdued, assimilated, and absorbed into Rome. But DNA doesn't lie for empires, and it doesn't disappear just because history books say it should. What this meant was deeply uncomfortable. Rome conquered Gaul politically, but not biologically. Celtic bloodlines didn't retreat to the edges of France. They didn't vanish. They went underground. They survived quietly inside families, villages, and regions that outwardly became Roman, then Frankish, then French, while carrying something much older beneath the surface. This wasn't cultural survival. This was genetic endurance. For over a century, French identity has been built on the idea of unity, one people, one language, one origin. Celtic identity was treated as either extinct or safely isolated in Brittany, reduced to folklore and regional color. But the DNA tells a harsher truth. France was never genetically unified, and the Celts were never erased. They didn't resist with flags or rebellions. They survived by blending, marrying locally, and passing their bloodline forward, generation after generation, until their presence became invisible, hidden in plain sight. And here's the part that changes everything. If Celtic DNA survived intact in regions that fully adopted Roman culture, then assimilation never worked the way Rome claimed it did, which means the foundation of modern France isn't Roman Frankish alone. It's Celtic too, buried, ignored, undeniable. So the real question isn't whether France has Celtic roots, it's how deep they run and how much of the country is built on a bloodline it stopped acknowledging centuries ago. Before we go further, if you're fascinated by hidden histories, forgotten peoples, and the DNA stories nations don't like to tell, subscribe to HELIX Origins. This channel exists to uncover what textbooks leave out, and this story is only just beginning. To understand how this bloodline survived conquest, empire, and time itself, we have to go back before France, before Rome, to the world the Celts once ruled. Long before France existed, before Rome looked north with ambition, Europe already had a dominant civilization. It wasn't Roman, it wasn't Greek, it was Celtic. By 500 BCE, Celtic peoples occupied an enormous stretch of the continent, from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the plains of Central Europe, from the British Isles deep into what is now northern Italy, Austria, and even parts of the Balkans. This wasn't a fringe culture clinging to forests and hills. This was the backbone of Iron Age Europe. The Celts weren't a single empire. They had no capital city, no emperor, no unified army. Instead, they were a network of tribes bound together by shared language families, religious traditions, artistic styles, and social structures. Different names, different chiefs, but a common world. And Gaul, modern France, was their core. When ancient writers spoke of Celtic Europe, they were often talking about Gaul specifically, a land of powerful tribes, wealthy trade networks, fortified towns, and skilled metalworkers. Greek merchants traded with them. Mediterranean elites prized Celtic iron and salt. Roman generals feared them. Centuries before Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Celtic warriors had already sacked Rome itself. This matters because it destroys the image of the Celts as primitive or marginal. They weren't waiting to be civilized.
centralized. They had their own systems, complex, regional, deeply rooted in land and ancestry. Celtic society was built around kinship. Bloodlines mattered. Lineage defined status. Land wasn't owned individually, but held through family and tribal ties. Marriages reinforced alliances. Identity wasn't abstract, it was inherited, which means Celtic identity wasn't just cultural, it was biological. When Rome finally turned its attention to Gaul in the 1st century BCE, it wasn't conquering empty territory, it was dismantling a population with centuries of genetic continuity behind it. Julius Caesar's own writings confirm this. In Commentari di Bello Gallico, he didn't describe Gaul as a single people, but he did acknowledge that its inhabitants shared languages, customs, and ancestry distinct from Rome. What followed was one of the most aggressive assimilation campaigns in ancient history. Roman legions crushed tribal resistance. Elites were co-opted. Latin became the language of administration. Roman law replaced tribal codes. Cities were rebuilt in Roman form. Roads stitched Gaul into the empire. From the outside, it worked. Within a few generations, Gaul looked Roman, spoke Latin, paid Roman taxes, worshipped Roman gods, at least publicly. But Rome made a critical mistake. It assumed culture equals blood. Romanization targeted behavior, language, and governance. It never replaced the population itself. There was no mass extermination, no large-scale resettlement of Italians into rural Gaul. The people remained where they were, farming the same land, marrying within the same valleys, passing down ancestry that Rome never touched. And unlike later invasions, Rome didn't flood Gaul with settlers. Roman soldiers retired. Some merchants stayed, but they were a thin layer atop millions of native inhabitants. The result was a surface transformation, not a biological one. Celtic languages faded, but Celtic families didn't. Tribal names disappeared, but tribal bloodlines continued. Public identity changed, but private inheritance remained intact. And when the Roman Empire began to crack in the 3rd and 4th centuries, something crucial happened.
The institutions collapsed faster than the people did. Roman authority retreated, cities shrank, administration dissolved, and in rural Gaul, the vast majority of the population, life quietly reverted to local structures rooted in kinship and land. The empire vanished. The bloodlines stayed. This is where the story France rarely tells begins to matter, because when later powers arrived, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Visigoths, they didn't replace the population either. They ruled it, intermarried at the top, adopted Roman Christian structures, but beneath them was the same genetic foundation laid down long before Rome ever crossed the Alps, which means the Celtic presence didn't survive by rebellion, it survived by continuity. Generation after generation living on the same soil, marrying locally, carrying forward ancestry that never needed a banner or a language to persist. And modern DNA would eventually expose that truth, because genetic markers don't care who ruled, they only record who reproduced. Rome didn't erase Gaul, it repainted it. This is the part history often blurs. When people imagine Roman conquest, they picture replacement, Romans flooding in, natives disappearing, identities wiped clean. But that's not what happened in Gaul. Rome conquered territory, not bloodlines. After Caesar's victory, Gaul became Roman in law, language, and appearance. Towns were redesigned with forums and baths. Latin replaced Celtic in public life. Local elites adopted Roman names, Roman clothing, Roman gods. On paper, Gaul was absorbed, but the countryside told a different story. Over 90% of the population lived in rural communities, small villages, farming families, people who never entered a forum or debated law in Latin. Their lives didn't revolve around Rome, they revolved around land, kin, and marriage. And Rome didn't interfere with that. There was no empire-wide policy of population replacement in Gaul, no mass deportations, no systematic breeding programs. Roman soldiers were stationed in forts, not villages. When they retired, many returned south or settled in towns, not deep rural valleys. So while Gaul looked Roman on the surface, its population remained overwhelmingly native, Celtic in ancestry, ancestry, Celtic in kinship, Celtic in biology. Language disappeared faster than any blood ever could. This matters because genetic inheritance doesn't need identity to survive. A family can stop calling itself Celtic and still carry Celtic DNA unchanged. Children inherit genes, not political loyalties, and Romanization targeted identity, not reproduction. Even intermarriage didn't dilute the population the way people assume. Roman settlers were a minority. Any genetic input they introduced was absorbed into a much larger native gene pool. Over time, the math worked against Rome. The locals outnumbered the conquerors. Then, Rome collapsed. By the 4th century, imperial authority in Gaul was already weakening. Taxes failed, roads decayed, garrisons withdrew. When the Western Roman Empire finally fell in the 5th century, Roman identity vanished almost overnight, but the people didn't. What remained was a population that had lived Roman, but descended from pre-Roman ancestors, a population that would soon be ruled by new elites who repeated the same mistake Rome made. The Franks didn't replace Gaul either, they conquered it. Frankish warriors became kings, their names entered dynasties, their laws governed land, but they were tiny in number compared to the millions already living there. They intermarried with local elites and adopted Latin Christianity within generations. They ruled a Celtic-descended population they never genetically displaced. And this is where the illusion of disappearance began. As Latin evolved into early French, as tribal names vanished from records, as Roman and Frankish labels replaced older ones, historians assumed the people had changed. They hadn't. Only the labels had. Families stayed rooted in the same regions for centuries. Parish records from the early medieval period show astonishing local continuity, the same surnames recurring in the same valleys, the same lineages farming the same land. Isolation did the rest. In mountainous regions, forests, and interior plateaus, movement was limited. People married nearby. Outsiders were rare. Even after France began forming as a centralized state, many regions remained socially closed well into the modern era. This created genetic preservation without cultural visibility. By the time France emerged as a nation, the Celtic bloodline was already invisible, but intact. Which is why modern geneticists were so surprised, because according to history, there shouldn't have been anything left to find, but DNA found it anyway. Not in songs, not in flags, not in language, in chromosomes, in patterns that matched Iron Age Gaul far more closely than Rome or the Franks. And once that door opened, the evidence began piling up. When geneticists began mapping regional DNA across France, they expected variation, but not defiance. Most modern nations show gradual blending of genetic components. Borders fade, populations mix over time, ancestry smooths out over time. France, on paper, should have been a textbook case of this process. It wasn't. Instead of a uniform genetic landscape, researchers found sharp internal structure, distinct clusters that refused to blend neatly into a single French profile. And at the center of those anomalies was a pattern that pointed backwards, past Rome, past the Franks, straight into Iron Age Gaul. Autosomal DNA, which captures ancestry from all lines, revealed that large portions of the French population carry ancestry components most closely aligned with ancient Celtic samples recovered from pre-Roman burial sites, not just in Brittany, not just in coastal enclaves, but deep inland. Y chromosome studies showed the same thing. Certain paternal haplogroups, particularly subclades of R1b, appeared in frequencies far higher than expected if Roman or Frankish replacement had occurred. These lineages matched patterns found in ancient Celtic remains across Western Europe. Mitochondrial DNA told a parallel story. Maternal lines, common in Iron Age Gaul, persisted in modern French populations with remarkable continuity. These weren't isolated survivals, they were widespread. The message was clear. The Celts didn't vanish, they became invisible. And invisibility turned out to be their greatest protection, because while France centralized politically, it remained fragmented biologically. Villages stayed villages, regions married locally, mobility was limited until very recently. Even into the 19th century, most people lived and died within a few dozen kilometers of where they were born. That kind of stability preserves DNA. What shocked researchers most wasn't the presence of Celtic ancestry, it was its strength. In some regions, the genetic signal was too strong to be explained as residual admixture. It suggested continuity, not dilution. In other words, words, the majority of people didn't descend from conquerors. They descended from the conquered. Rome changed laws, the Franks changed rulers, but the people beneath stayed largely the same. And this forces a re-evaluation of French identity itself.
Because if modern France is genetically rooted in Celtic Gaul, then the idea of total Roman assimilation collapses. The Gauls didn't become Romans in blood, they became Romans in name, which means France isn't post-Celtic, it's post-Celtic in language only. And the deeper researchers dug, the clearer this became. Ancient DNA comparisons showed direct continuity between Iron Age Gauls and modern French populations in regions thought to have been completely transformed by Rome. No break, no replacement, no disappearance, just adaptation. Celtic ancestry survived because it didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need symbols or rebellion. It persisted in families, marriages, and local communities that quietly carried it forward while empires rose and fell above them. France didn't erase its Celtic past. It absorbed it and forgot it, until DNA remembered. The survival of Celtic DNA inside France wasn't accidental, it was structural. France didn't erase its Celtic population because it never truly touched the mechanisms that preserve ancestry. Empires change power, states change language, but bloodlines are preserved by something far more mundane: marriage patterns, geography, and habit. For most of French history, people didn't move. Until the Industrial Age, the average person lived, married, and died within a small radius. Villages were socially closed ecosystems. Outsiders were rare. Families intermarried locally for generations. This wasn't ideology, it was logistics. Travel was difficult. Land was inherited. Community mattered more than empire. That kind of social inertia is a genetic vault. Even as Latin replaced Celtic speech, even as Roman and later French identity became dominant, ancestry continued quietly. Children didn't stop inheriting genes just because their parents stopped using old names. And in many regions, geography reinforced isolation. The Massif Central, interior plateaus, forested zones, and mountainous regions were never migration highways. They weren't attractive to settlers. They weren't centers of power. They were places people stayed, which meant the descendants of Iron Age Gauls stayed too. By the time France centralized politically, by the time Paris imposed language, law, and schooling, the genetic foundations were already locked in. Cultural suppression came centuries too late to affect biology. The state could ban dialects, it could punish regional identity, it could rewrite history, it couldn't rewrite DNA. What's striking is that Celtic ancestry survived better where Celtic culture disappeared faster. Once identity went underground, it stopped drawing attention. No rebellion, no separatism, just quiet continuity. Invisibility became survival. And this explains why Brittany is only part of the story, not the whole of it. Brittany preserved Celtic language and symbols, making its ancestry obvious. The rest of France preserved Celtic blood without preserving Celtic labels. Two different strategies, same result, which leads to a deeper realization. France didn't just absorb Celtic ancestry, it is Celtic ancestry, wearing Roman and Frankish layers on top. This reframes the entire idea of French origins. The Gauls didn't vanish into history, they became the population base upon which everything else was built. Modern France is not post-Celtic, it is Celtic at its core, biologically continuous from Iron Age Europe to the present day. And that realization changes how we understand Europe itself. For centuries, European history has been told as a sequence of replacements. Celts replaced by Romans, Romans replaced by Germanic peoples, Germanic kingdoms becoming modern nations. DNA exposes how wrong that model is. What actually happened was layering. Empires ruled populations they never replaced. Elites changed. Languages shifted. Administrations collapsed. But the people beneath remained remarkably stable. France is one of the clearest examples of this, and one of the most uncomfortable, because acknowledging Celtic continuity means acknowledging that the French nation wasn't born from a clean break. It was built on a population whose identity was deliberately erased while its ancestry endured. The Gauls didn't disappear. They were renamed, then forgotten, until genetics forced the issue. Today, researchers use French DNA to reconstruct Iron Age Europe, Modern French populations act as living archives, preserving genetic information about Celtic societies that left few written records of their own. Through them, scientists can trace prehistoric migration, marriage networks, and population structure across Western Europe. They can see how resilient ancestry is when populations stay rooted to land. And for ordinary people, the implications are personal. Millions of French citizens carry Celtic ancestry without knowing it. No songs, no stories, no markers, until a DNA test reveals connections to a world they were taught no longer existed. This isn't about romanticizing the Celts, it's about recognizing survival. France's hidden Celtic bloodline proves that conquest doesn't equal erasure, that identity can vanish while ancestry persists, that nations are far older and far more complex than the stories they tell about themselves. The Celts didn't lose Europe, they became Europe. France likes to see itself as unified, rational, and born of Rome. DNA tells a messier story. Beneath the language, beneath the institutions, beneath the myth of total assimilation lies continuity stretching back more than 2,000 years. The bloodline of Iron Age Gaul is still here, in cities, in villages, in people who will never call themselves Celtic, but are descended from Celts all the same. This isn't a regional anomaly, it's a national inheritance. France didn't erase its Celtic past, it carried it forward unknowingly. And that makes the Celts one of the most successful surviving populations in European history, not because they resisted forever, but because they endured quietly. They didn't need monuments, they didn't need empires, they didn't need recognition, they needed time, and time gave them victory. If this story changed how you see France, Europe, or your own ancestry, subscribe to HELIX Origins. This channel exists to uncover the histories hidden beneath modern nations, the bloodlines that survived conquest, silence, and centuries of forgetting. What other peoples are still hiding inside the countries we think we understand? I'll see you in the next one.